Welcome to the College Recruiter webinar. The subject of today's discussion will be on the subject, Want Better Candidates? Ask Better Questions. My name is Andrea McEwen Henderson, and I will be your host for today. I am one of the national account managers with College Recruiter. I have actually over a dozen years of experience in helping large and small employers reach recent college graduates and students. My primary responsibilities are facilitating our webinars, moderating the discussions of our college recruiting bootcamp conferences, as well as working with small to medium-sized employers on their entry-level hiring needs. College Recruiter is the highest traffic college job board with 150,000 unique monthly visitors. We help employers reach recent graduates and students of 1, 2, and 4-year colleges and graduate schools. We have permission to deliver emails on behalf of our employer clients to 7 million recent graduates and 10 million students, and we can also target them by major, school, year of graduation, diversity, and more. Our other solutions for employers include job postings, targeted mobile banner ads, targeted display ads, virtual career fairs, and our custom research projects. For more information about College Recruiter, you can reach us at www.collegerecruiter.com/contact or 952-848-2211. Today's guest is David Sarnowski, Customer Experience Manager at Harkin. I'll now turn the webinar over to David. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Andrea. I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure to be here with you and with College Recruiter today. I'm really excited to talk to you today about helping you identify better candidates and ultimately doing that through asking better questions. Our entire goal at Harkin is to help people align and accelerate their recruitment process, and asking a better question is central to that. So let's go ahead and let's get started. The reality is that when you're hiring, if you make a mistake, you're stuck with it. And you're typically stuck with it for a period of time. Now, we're not good at getting rid of people that were mishired. We're just not. And part of that is due to employment law, and that's fine, that's great. But the reality is that once you bring somebody into your organization, that person will impact your customer, your teammates, and your brand for however long they're there. And so you need to make sure that during your interview, during your screening process, you're asking the right questions to get at the bottom of, is this person the right fit for me? Now, I'd like to make sure that we highlight and give credit where credit is due. A lot of our thinking on this subject comes from Mark Murphy's research at Leadership IQ, so do check him out, check out his website. He's got some great resources and is a tremendous speaker on the subject, so really want to highlight him and point him out to you. Now again, here's the reality. We hire people and sometimes it doesn't work out. And the thing that's shocking to us, especially coming out of Mark Murphy's research, was that they identified that 89% of people were failing for reasons other than technical competency. So we're doing a really good job at screening for skill. We're doing a great job of that. The issue is that there are a whole lot of people who are failing for reasons other than skill. And we're not doing a good job of getting to those things. And those things revolve around attitude, and attitude comes out from questioning. And the reality, too, is, again, a bad hire doesn't just hit the cost of replacing that person. There's impact, obviously, on your hiring time. You know, if you are just looking to fill new positions, your recruitment team could stay focused, but you're dealing with turnover constantly. And part of that turnover is replacing people who are bad hires. So there's certainly expense for that. But then you're also impacting things like lost worker productivity, employee morale, brand identity. All of those things are impacted by someone who's not a great fit for your organization. And so you need to take those things into account when you're really thinking about and analyzing what does a bad hire cost us. So where do we get started? The first step to asking great questions is to stop asking poor questions. Garbage in, garbage out. Now I want to be very clear, candidates and people are not garbage, our questions are. If we're asking questions that result in us getting unhelpful answers, answers that are not going to allow us to differentiate between candidates, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we need to stop that. So what makes a question ineffective? First of all, if all of your candidates are answering a question the same way, it's a bad question. You need to set up questions that allow people to differentiate themselves, that allow top performers to stand out from low performers. And if everybody answers your interview questions exactly the same way, get rid of it. It's not helpful for you. Anything hypothetical. If you ask a hypothetical question, you're going to get a hypothetical answer. And you really want to get at the heart of what is this person's practical experience and practical approach in real terms. And then the last one is the if you were a blank, which would you be? If you were a tree, if you were a Disney princess, any of these outlandish, off-the-wall questions that you've heard before. First of all, they don't tell you anything viable. Google was the big winner with this in asking absurd questions, and they've given that up because they realize when they go back and study performance, it didn't inform them about anything. The other is it just makes you look ridiculous. Let's talk about some of the other usual suspects. Tell me about yourself. It's such a broad question that it doesn't really inform you in any way. Why should we hire you? Well, that's what you're trying to find out. Don't let the candidate tell you by answering that question. Let them tell you by answering questions about how they approach their day-to-day work. That's how they're going to tell you. And also, what are your greatest strengths and what are your greatest weaknesses? There are a ton of great resources for candidates to learn how to answer this question, and the reality is most people don't answer it truthfully. If people would tell you that they're really lazy and that they're hardly ever on time, these would be great questions, but they're never going to answer that way, so get rid of them. Remember, your questions, you need to know what they do, what they're supposed to tell you if you're going to get the most out of them. So let's start with the end in mind. You need to know the type of person, the type of attitude that you need for somebody to excel in the position that you're hiring for. And you need to leave the job description out. Most recruiters and hiring managers will go back to the job description and say, this is the type of person that I'm looking for. That's not it. That tells you what you want that person to do. That doesn't tell you what attitude you want to be able to do those things. So then you need to find out, how do you find out the attitude that you want? Well, you need to interview some people. And who can you interview? You can interview your peak performers, the people who are excelling in your organization. Go and take some interview questions that you want to ask potential new candidates and ask your peak performers. See if there's a consistency across their responses that gives you an insight into attitude. Ask your external customers, your internal customers. Ask your poor performers. Now, when you ask a poor performer, you don't want to go walk up and say, why are you a bad performer? But you can take them and say, I've got some new interview questions. Help me out for a minute. How would you respond to this? Take their answers. Compare those against your peak performers. And then also ask teammates and hiring managers of those people. So if you ask the hiring manager or the teammate of a peak performer, what attitude or traits does this person have that makes them great? They'll tell you. They'll also tell you for somebody who's not pulling their weight. So use these interviews to help guide you in addition to what you're looking for. Now, next thing is we want to talk about day one skills versus day two. As we already mentioned, screening for skill is easy. We tend to be pretty good at that, but yet we invest a huge amount of time and effort in screening for that, and we also tend to screen for skills that you don't necessarily need. So I want to clarify, a day one skill is a skill that somebody has to have before they can even walk in the door for you. And you really need to work to be honest with yourself about what those are. So these aren't things that would be nice for them to have. This has to be literally, there's no way you can possibly succeed if you don't have this skill or certification. Now, a day two skill is any skill that you can teach or that somebody can gradually move in. I'll give you an example. I've seen people hire to say you must expert Excel at Microsoft Excel. Now, is that really true? You could have somebody who's an expert in spreadsheets like Google Sheets or OpenOffice spreadsheets where their skill set is entirely transferable, but they're not technically an expert in Microsoft Excel. Would you turn that great candidate away? Think about that. Now, you need to think about this in construct of the 2020 skills gap. This is coming. The baby boomers are going to retire, and when they do, we are going to have a tremendous loss of skill, and it's going to become much harder for you to identify and find the people that you want. So even though you still need to screen for skill, you're not going to be able to screen to the extent that you used to, because there just won't be that many people with the skills you need. We know that we're trying to ask schools to catch up and help us out there, but as an employer, you need to be thinking about hiring people who have the attitude to be coached and taught so that you can carry on the skills that you need and sustain yourself as a business. Now, once you identify great questions, you need to make sure that you've got some sort of guide that tells one good answer from another. And you need to give that to the people who are involved in interviewing. It's no good if you give your hiring managers, hey guys, we've got 10 great questions we want you to use, but then you've given them no guidance of what an answer, a good answer or a bad answer looks like. Now, in terms of rolling out better questions in your process, it's critical to understand that your screening process is only one step. Typically what happens with a webinar like this, you go and you learn some things about asking better questions, and your default is to run back and try to jam all of them into your initial interview with a candidate. And you don't need to do that. You need to recognize that your phone screen or your video interview screen, whatever you're doing to initially scrub candidates, is one step in your process, and you just need to make sure that by the time you get to the end of your process, you've used all of your questions. You've hit at all your attitude. Don't pour them all into the beginning, because you'll end up turning away candidates and potentially just blowing your mind out. Okay, so focus here. Now, in order to do this, map your process from end to end and know what all of your individual stages are. It's critical that you do that, and take a look at reviewing those resources. Now, spreading your questions out, again, if you think about this, if you identify 3 core attitudes and 2 questions for each one of those attitudes, you can easily spread those out across the different stages of your process and make sure that you're reinforcing all the attitudes that you need, but giving some different aspects and different questions to your candidates, which I think is really important. There's nothing worse as a candidate than being asked the same question over and over again. Yes, it drives home to me that that's important to you, but what it ends up saying to me as a candidate is, don't you guys talk to each other? I just answered that to the guy down the hall. So ask a different question that gets at the same attitude, so you're giving variety to the candidate and you're going to give better veracity to their answers. If a candidate answers an attitude question one way and then answers the same question about another attitude, or sorry, a different question about that same attitude differently, that's cause for concern. But if they're right on track, they essentially pass both questions, they're reaffirming that they really have that attitude. Okay, so get that spread out whenever you can. Now, let's put some questions into place. Let's make questions that help people think. So again, where do you get good questions? Go back to your best performers. Identify several questions that you want to ask, and ask them to your high performers and ask them to your low performers. And if for a question to be good, the answers of these 2 groups should be able to be differentiated. Your high performers should respond in such a way that you identify some key attributes that are different from your low performers. Again, if they all answer it the same way, it's not a good question. Once you locked in some questions or some attitudes from these 2 groups, then we can go back and really look at identifying great questions that affirm those. So again, how do you do that? We've identified some attitudes that are crucial for our high performers and crucial for our low performers. So first, we want to select a situation that again would allow that attitude to be displayed one way or the other. We want to ask about a situation. So can you describe for me a situation where you had to work under pressure? Could you, can you, have you? We want to start with that. That just as a quick note, this is different from saying to somebody, tell me about a time. Because if somebody is asked to tell you about a time, that's not a question, that's a directive. Okay, and you can set people off just a little bit. Ask a question, it's much more amiable, it's much better, it lets people go. And then the next step is let that question hang. And we'll come to that here in just a moment. So here are 2 examples of traditional questions. Could you tell me about a time when you dealt with a difficult customer and what you did to resolve the situation? We just broke that question by adding the end, what did you do to resolve the situation? You don't want to assume that they did anything to resolve the situation. You want to let the candidate tell you whether or not they did. They might have just dealt with a customer, and they might respond by complaining to you, like, oh yeah, George walks into the office or into the store and it's horrible. He's a terrible guy. They're just going to tell you about this, and what you're learning from that is that this is a person who does not figure out how to solve a problem with this customer. They just know how to complain about them. So leave that end section out. Could you tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult customer? Could you tell me about a time when you faced a challenging project and then you ruin it by adding and how you delivered it successfully? Leave out that end. When you face a challenging project, let them tell you whether or not they succeeded. Don't presume or lean towards success or failure. Let your candidates tell you what actually happened. This will tell you whether or not they have proactive or negative approaches, and that's what you ultimately want to get at. Okay? After you ask your question, leave it hanging and listen. So here's an example. Could you tell me about a time when you dealt with a difficult customer? And here are two different sets of responses that show you different attitudes. Now, in green, I've got some responses that could be tied to a positive response, and red a negative. Now, I do want to be clear that a good answer depends on what you're looking for. So if you are an employer that requires people, your employees, to not be distracted and empathetic to customers, then the answers on the left may actually not be positive ones for you. You might want to find employees who answer more on the right, that they just get them out of the way and they move on to the next person. If you're somebody that values empathy, then you're going to want to look for questions or responses on the left. Okay. Another example. Can you give me an example when you of a situation where you disagreed with your supervisor? Again, you may be an employer that has a very strict structure, and so you want them to respond in a certain way, or you might be a little bit more free. So you yourself need to determine which attitudes matter and pick which responses are best. But you can see here that these responses are acting almost as an answer key, that if somebody answers on the right, that's something that we're not looking for. Somebody answers on the left, it's something that we're looking for. And you can determine that. Okay. Here are some other sample questions that, again, we just picked three skill sets or three attitude sets we would want to hire people for, and we created some questions that would set someone up in a scenario that they would respond in such a way as to expose their attitude around these approaches. So these are available for you to look at. Again, I would highlight Mark Murphy. He's got a ton of great questions and resources, but these are some that you can certainly use at your discretion. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and just close our presentation and open it up to take some questions.
Thank you so much, David. Quite informative. And we actually have about 4 questions. So the first one actually comes from a recruiter, and they work for an RPO, and they say they're not really connected to the corporate culture. What should they do in this type of situation?
Sure, great question. Yeah, in order to ask questions about attitude, you need to know what attitudes are successful, and you're absolutely right. When the further removed you are away from the day-to-day operations of the business, the harder it can be to identify those attitudes. But this is an opportunity for you to stand out. You know, if you're especially an RPO, obviously where you are operating essentially as the hiring wing of that organization, what you need to do is go back to your client and go to the hiring managers where you're placing people, and you need to find out whenever somebody leaves one of those positions, you need to go to that hiring manager and find out why. What attitudes or traits led this person to not be successful? And as you learn those things, bring those back. The same thing when you place a good hire. Follow up with your hiring manager a month, 2 months, 3 months into the person's placement and ask them how they're performing. If they're doing really well, ask that hiring manager why. I promise you, if you take that additional step to really dig deep with your client, not only are you going to demonstrate that your level of service is better and different than some competitors, but you're also going to be in a scenario where you can take that feedback and use it to ultimately give your client better employees, and that ultimately is what you're trying to do to secure and save that business.
Great, great. Now, someone says that technical skills, they're easy to test for and to quantify. Do you recommend spreading out hard skill tests the way you do questions for attitude, such as, mastering open office, Google Docs, and not knowing Excel?
Gotcha. Yep. Um, Again, I think I would just go back identifying the differentiation between a day one skill versus a day two skill. If you have a day two skill, or sorry, a day one skill that is absolutely without question essential, so we've confirmed that this is not something that somebody can translate from different experience or anything like that. This is a very specific thing they have to have. I would do that up front and early so that you can screen out the people who don't have that. Now, if you have a day two skill where you can either have something that somebody can transfer in and learn and adjust a little bit, certainly ask those questions. So for example, in the Microsoft Excel situation, you could just say, do you have experience working with spreadsheets in a particular program? Tell us which one. And they let somebody describe that experience for you. You could ask that and spread those out across your interviewing process. But so day one skills, put them up in front. Day two, you could spread out.
Got it. Now, what if a recruiter asks a question in an interview about a situation and the candidate can't think of anything to say? What then?
Step one, let them hang. That sounds tough and or cruel, but here's the reality. It's human nature to want to fill silence. It's hard to stay quiet. So if you ask a question and a candidate doesn't have an answer, let them sit for a minute. It might just be that you've got a thoughtful candidate who needs a minute to gather their thoughts. It's a great answer if you have a candidate that comes back and says, I'm sorry, I don't have an example of that situation. First of all, if they come back to you with that direct focus, that's a very confident candidate, and that's actually a great trait. If you have somebody who starts to go into the hypothetical realm, that's a red flag for you. That's another reason, too, to make sure that you identify a couple of questions that hit at the same attitude but are different situations. Because if you did ask that question and you really had to drill down, you could ask an alternate situation to a candidate and see if they could respond to that.
Thank you, David. That's all the questions we have. I'd like to thank you for attending this College Recruiter webinar. The subject of today's discussion was Want Better Candidates? Ask Better Questions. My name is Andrea McEwen Henderson, and I was your host for today. I am one of the National Account Managers with College Recruiter. I have a dozen years of experience in helping large and small employers reach recent college graduates and students. My primary responsibilities are facilitating our webinars, moderating the discussions at our college recruiting bootcamp conferences, as well as working with small to medium-sized employers on their entry-level hiring needs. College Recruiter is the highest traffic college job board with 150,000 unique monthly visitors. We help employers reach recent graduates and students of 1-, 2-, and 4-year colleges and graduate schools. We have permission to deliver emails on behalf of our employer clients to 7 million recent graduates and 10 million students, and we can also target them by major, school, year of graduation, diversity, and more. Our other solutions for employers include job postings, targeted mobile banner ads, targeted display ads, virtual career fairs, and our custom research projects. For more information about College Recruiter, you can reach us at www.collegerecruiter.com/contact or 952-848-2211. Today's guest was David Sardowski, Customer Experience Manager at Harkin. Thank you for joining us today.